Hi, welcome. I'm Colleen Coulter, Senior Publisher on the Philosophy List here at Bloomsbury, and you're all very welcome to Conversations in Contemporary Aesthetics. Before we get started, I'm going to give you a bit of background into how we've all come to find ourselves on Zoom talking about itches, Taco Bell, The Phantom Menace, and Taylor Swift. We've organised this panel around our growing series of case studies. The series sits at the heart of a larger digital collection dedicated to aesthetics. Aesthetics has always been a central focus of our book list. The digital collection allows us to go beyond the constraints of print and create an online resource where aesthetics can be studied and taught in the round. Whether that is through the case studies, ebooks, images, videos, or conversations such as these, a digital platform offers numerous ways into this dynamic, vibrant subject. We've seen changes in how instructors are teaching aesthetics, and this variety of formats is a response to those changes. The aim is to provide a home for anyone looking for new ideas for classes. And why aesthetics? Well, for us, it's where some of the most innovative, meaningful work in philosophy is being done, something I don't need to tell anyone who has signed up for this panel. At a time when philosophers are sometimes accused of being too dry, abstract, or removed from the everyday, we find those working in aesthetics deal with concrete examples from ordinary life, and they aren't afraid to connect with other fields and disciplines. But most importantly, however, aesthetics is fun. Guiding me through taste, judgment, and appreciation over the last decade has been Darren Hudson-Hick. Darren is the author of our popular textbook, Introducing Aesthetics and Philosophy of Art, now in its third edition. A wonderfully clear, imaginative writer with an unbelievable eye for detail, he is always a joy to read, whether he is introducing Kant or unraveling NFTs. Darren is our general editor of the Contemporary Aesthetics Case Studies, responsible for finding brilliant philosophers to write 3,000 words on cases that matter to them. It is our great pleasure to bring Darren together today with four of these authors. While we can't make any promises, they may well change how you think about enjoying a Taco Bell, scratching an itch, Star Wars Episode 1, and Taylor Swift's re-recordings. If you have questions, just drop them into the Q&A and there'll be time for them at the end. I hope you enjoy their conversations, and I'll hand over to Darren now.
Has it been handed over? Is it me? Am I live? Hi, Colleen. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of a background to the project. The project started as a sketch of an idea for a book of case studies, something that could serve as a resource for instructors teaching aesthetics, maybe a little like bathroom reading. Philosophy of art and aesthetics are all about cases. Everything I write is anchored in cases. Every essay I write, every chapter I write. Cases give us something to dig our teeth into, to ground our questions. In terms of pedagogy, cases catch a student's attention. They're something real in a domain that tends to drift towards the abstract. To me, cases make philosophy real. So I had, at this point, no real plan in mind for the book, just a sort of notion that this might be a useful thing someday in the future. But Colleen asked if I'd be interested in doing the case study collection instead as a digital product, as a part of the Bloomsbury Philosophy Library, which was then, I think, a mere twinkle in Colleen's eye. And I have problems saying no to Colleen. So we decided to do the case studies in waves, with about 20 cases per wave published annually. So my plan was to pick 20 writers who I thought represented the breadth of the field, and then set them loose to pick their own cases. The things that excite them, the things that they use to excite their students. First and foremost, I wanted contributors who could write. And in part, this is because I'm lazy, and I wanted to do as little actual hands-on editing as possible. But the idea was a series of case studies that would serve as wedges into aesthetics and the philosophy of art for students new to the topic. So I wanted writers who could write for students with little to no background in aesthetics and philosophy generally. So I was looking for a particular kind of writer, and it's something that philosophy doesn't tend to produce naturally on its own. So here's a pro tip for getting people to write essentially for free. Tell them to write about what they're excited about. However they want to write it. Tell them to put their voice into it. Because with this approach, pretty much everybody I asked said yes. And the cases they wrote were so wonderful. So some of the people who aren't here today, Chris Bartel wrote on a Degas sculpture and how much of a role the artist's history should play in our interpretations. Lisa Jones wrote on pro wrestling events as art. Mary Beth Willard wrote on a Vermeer painting and on questions of genuineness and art restoration. Yuriko Sato wrote about the surprising aesthetic value of manhole covers. Lee Cray wrote on Batman. Elizabeth Scarborough, whose birthday it is today, wrote on a piece of decaying architecture off the Florida coast. Henry Pratt's case on beards is one of the funniest things I've ever read. Not one of the funniest pieces of philosophy, one of the funniest things I've ever read. Dom Lopez's case on beautiful philosophy is, as it happens, one of the most beautiful pieces of philosophical writing I've ever encountered. A surprising number of the cases are quite personal, telling stories about the authors at the same time that they introduce questions about art. I am in awe of this collection and that I get to attach my name to it. The collection is so much better than anything I could have written myself. The sheer diversity of cases so wonderfully represents the great variety of voices in this field. So the first wave was published last spring. The second wave came out, a month ago? I'm currently editing the third wave. So I want to take an opportunity to introduce the people who are going to be joining us today. So we've got Sherry Irvin. Sherry Irvin is professor of philosophy and women's and gender studies and senior associate dean at the Graduate College of the University of Oklahoma. Sherry is probably one of the most respected people in aesthetics today. Sherry wrote on the aesthetic appreciation of itches. I just spent 3 days in the woods and I forgot to bring bug repellent. I am really into Sherry's case right now. Alex King is going to be joining us. She's associate professor of philosophy at Simon Fraser University. She's editor of the Aesthetics for Birds blog, which is probably the most notable source of public-facing aesthetics that is out there. James Harold is professor of philosophy at Mount Holyoke College. Among other things, he's the editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Ethics and Art. James wrote on the Phantom Edit, which is a fan re-ed of Star Wars Episode 1. And Brandon Polite is associate professor and chair of the philosophy department at Knox College. He is the host of a YouTube series that used to be called Polite Conversations. It might have changed names, in which he interviews philosophers of art about their recent philosophical work. Brandon wrote on Taylor Swift re-recording her entire back catalog. So I'm going to hand this back over to Christina, who is going to give us a walkthrough.
Hi, everyone. I'm now going to give you a quick tour of the Bloomsbury Contemporary Aesthetics collection, which published all the case studies you'll hear about today. And this is hosted on the Bloomsbury Philosophy Library platform. It's one of 4 collections on the platform. We have a collection on 20th century French thought that contains primary texts in translation and secondary literature. We have a collection on the history of modern aesthetics, which contains newly digitized, difficult to find primary texts and introductions to those texts, as well as secondary literature. And the Encyclopedia of Philosophers, which has 8,300 peer-reviewed entries. And finally, the collection that is hosting this webinar today, Bloomsbury Contemporary Aesthetics. Just clicking through to this, you can see the different content types available. We have the case studies, which we're discussing today. And these, along with Aesthetics and Politics in the Global South, a reference work, are exclusive to the platform and can't be found anywhere else. This reference work is for students and scholars in philosophy, literary studies, and politics looking to decolonize the aesthetic tradition. It's called Aesthetics and Politics in the Global South. The collection also contains primary texts and scholarly monographs from a range of publishers, as well as an image gallery with almost 300 images selected by philosophers for their ability to spark discussions in the classroom. And these are accompanied by discussion prompts. Just going back up to the case studies, let's just quickly look at the list of cases. We have 39 cases and more coming in the future. And I'm just going to quickly show you the Taylor Swift case, which is one of the ones that will be discussed today. You can see the sections here and jump down to further readings, for example. And scrolling back up, you can see on the left-hand side the metadata. If we click through to the music, film, and theatre category, this brings up all of the results from across the whole platform related to that category. And you can see there are 628 results here. Looking down the left-hand side, you can filter further by subject, movement or school of thought, people, periods, place, primary text, and content type. And if we filter by case study, we'll find other case studies relevant to the music, film, and theatre category. And that includes the Phantom Edit, which is going to be discussed in conjunction with the Taylor Swift case study. And I just want to show you one more thing on the platform before we kick off. That's under content types. This is our teaching and learning tools page. We have teaching guides on how to diversify your philosophy curriculum, subject guides on Islamic philosophers and women philosophers, and a range of other guides and introductions, including Darren's introduction to the case studies, which is available for everyone to read, and I'd really recommend you read it. And I wanted to show that the case studies again appear listed here, but this time grouped under theme, which makes it really handy for educators looking for readings around a particular topic. And these themes range from aesthetic experience to culture and identity, everyday aesthetics, food, imagination, law, narrative, perception, all the way down to what is art. And thanks for watching the demo. We're going to be circulating free login codes to everyone who registered to this, so that you can explore the platform, including all 4 collections for yourself in your own time. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Darren.
Welcome back to me. Okay, so I'm just going to be having a conversation now with Sherry and Alex. Nothing has been pre-planned, so we'll see how all of this goes. I've already given a brief mention of what Sherry and Alex wrote on, but I'm going to start with this question. I told you you could write on anything. I didn't want to tell you what to write on. And you chose respectively itches and the Taco Bell crunchy beef taco. Why did you choose these things?
I wrote about itches in an essay published in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism some years ago, but I'm just still very interested in the texture of somatic experience. So, right now you might consider, how does your tongue feel in your mouth? What's the sensation of your tongue in your mouth? And there's all of this wealth of somatic information available to us all the time. And I just find contemplating that and the role that it plays in so many aspects of our life is really fascinating. So that's why I wanted to revisit that.
I feel like, so I've been interested in like high and low art for some time. And it's a personal interest to me, as well as like professional academic interest. And I just thought that this was an opportunity. I was sort of mulling over different things I might write about. And then this like episode from my life came back to me, and I was like, okay, I think that I have a hook and a case study to frame the discussion around. And I feel like ironic appreciation is something that gets talked about a lot in public discourse and less so in professional academic contexts. And so it was a kind of fun way to explore that for me.
So for the people who haven't read the cases, your case is starts with a real conversation. It reads like Descartes' Meditations. It's a recounting of a walkthrough, talking about a friend saying, well, maybe you can tell us a little about the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So I was in grad school, and a friend of mine, we were just talking about, I don't even remember what, we were like driving somewhere, I think. And maybe there was like a Taco Bell, those like roadside signs that are like, oh, get off at this exit for these things. And I was like, oh, I love Taco Bell. And he was like, yeah, but like ironically, right? And I was like, what the hell, dude? Like, no. And it was kind of like a moment for me where I was like, I'm not actually even sure what you're asking me. liking, I think it's also interesting to think through like what it means to like food ironically versus liking like a movie ironically or something like that. But yeah, definitely a real story. Definitely that's how it happened.
Now, I mean, for people who aren't familiar with philosophy of art or haven't been keeping up on what it looks like now, talking about aesthetically appreciating itches, talking about Taco Bell as a serious subject of philosophical inquiry, does this represent what aesthetics looks like today, or the trajectory of aesthetics?
I mean, I hope so. I think, I mean, and Sherry can jump in here, but from my perspective, as someone who's like sort of relatively newer to the field, I think my view is a lot of, especially like historically and into the 20th century, aesthetics and philosophy of art was dominated by a lot of kind of, to my mind, slightly conservative views of what counts as art and what even like, you know, there's avant-garde art and that doesn't feel super conservative when you're looking at it from one perspective, but when you're looking at it from the perspective of drinking a Baja Blast, then it's a little bit like, how relatable is this to my everyday life? How much does this fit into, you know, it's sort of like art and aesthetics, that sort of stuff is for like the fancy person who goes to museums all the time versus like me in my life.
Yeah, and I think it's true that, you know, there's been a movement over the past several decades of people doing what's now often called everyday aesthetics, and really thinking about, wait a second, these concepts of appreciation and value that had previously been discussed mainly in relation to art and sometimes elevated experiences of nature, like what if we just brought those into everyday life and thought about everyday experiences as having a lot of those same qualities? Maybe sometimes they're turned down a little bit, the volume's not as high on intensity of some of them, or maybe actually sometimes it is. You know, when I think about itches and other somatic phenomena, there can be high levels of intensity, but it's not as structured as you might find in an artwork. It's more ephemeral. So it's a little bit harder to pin down. And of course, it's difficult. It's more, you know, we don't both have access to my somatic experience. So we can be like, ooh, so let's talk about it. But at the same time, I can still recognize and assess the qualities of that experience. So I think there has been this movement toward opening up the terrain of aesthetics to allow for some of these things that had previously been thought of as, oh, it's not really that. It's supposed to be something more special.
Well, I mean, your first paper on itches that was published a few years back, and I've taught this a lot of times, and every time I do, I discover new itches. You don't just push sort of the limits of what's an appropriate topic for aesthetics, you push the limit of what counts as aesthetic. And I think that's really interesting because there's been, you know, a near century of debate at this point about what qualifies as aesthetic experience versus, I don't know, something else. Do you think you found the edge? Do you think that this is at the outer limit?
I don't know that, you know, people ask me questions about those limits sometimes, and I'm just like, I don't know. I mean, I'm just so interested in the way that felt experience has qualities that are sometimes foregrounded and intense, and they're sometimes kind of in the background. The taco comes out. Sometimes they're in the background, but they're still coloring the texture of felt experience in to a degree of consciousness that can really vary. Sometimes they pop up, and itches are a great example of something that can crop up, and then you'll find that your attention is like moving around your body to different, you know, other itches. And then you're like, oh, what does my foot feel like pressing against the floor right now? And then eventually it just kind of recedes. And so when I think about what is it like to be a human in the world, what does that feel like? To me, I feel like there's something inherently aesthetic about that whole thing. And I find that really fascinating. And so there's a part of me that is like, well, if you want to say that's not aesthetic, but it's something else, I just want to say, okay, I mean, but that just doesn't, I just don't really care about whether it's on one side of the line or the other too much. Although I do try to make arguments about, well, Bob Stecker's view of what aesthetic experience is seems to actually apply to experiences of itches. You know, you are, if you're attending to them, you are attending to the form of something as it unfolds in time in a way that's not attached to instrumental goals or outcomes. I mean, unless you're like mosquito, okay, then maybe that's a non-aesthetic attention. But if I'm just like, wow, you know, I'm just feeling this feeling because I'm fascinated by it, it seems to actually fit a lot of the definitions. So I just try to, you know, make a case for thinking about something I'm interested in by saying, see, it fits that definition.
Now, both of you picked things that, I mean, yes, are sort of representing contemporary aesthetics in a way that has put behind, as Alex put it, more conservative targets of philosophical concern. But you've also picked things out of, I mean, your ordinary lives. Alex picked something out of a conversation that she had. Sherry, you've picked something I'm feeling right now. It's horrible. But also, thanks to sitting in the woods and rereading your case and forgetting bug spray, I got to really sort of delve into, is this how y'all work? Do you draw on your own lives and say, I'm finding philosophical value not in a journal, but in the things that I'm doing with my spare time? Can you help yourselves at this point?
I think for me, it's a little bit of a blessing and a curse. Sometimes I just want to like go to a museum and enjoy it like it's not work. But it's very hard to kind of quiet that, or like, I want to have a conversation about, let's, you know, do you want to go to Taco Bell or do you want to go to McDonald's? And I just want that to be like a regular conversation that a regular person would have, and not have it overlaid and like constantly have this like meta dialogue in my head, like what can I mine for like a paper or for ideas or whatever. On the other hand, it is actually really fun to be able to find like relate your professional interests and stuff like that to stuff that does happen in your regular life. So I mean, that's my take at least.
Mm-hmm. At the time that I wrote the original paper, I was doing a lot of meditation. I was doing like Zen meditation practice at a monastery in Ottawa, Ontario, where I lived at that time. And so definitely and I also had done, I think, a 10-day silent meditation retreat that involved body scanning. So somatic awareness was very much part of a totally non-philosophical thing that I was doing. These days, I just like to write about stuff I'm inherently interested in. But also, I've kind of turned my work a little bit more to thinking about how the aesthetic plays a role in power relationships and social hierarchy. And this time, when I wrote the case study, I kind of connected it to, we receive cultural training in the way that we somatically respond to each other's embodied presence. And that can actually play a role in either establishing solidarity or in social hierarchy. And so a lot of my work now is trying to think about the aesthetics of the everyday, but in relation to social phenomena, power dynamics, and that I do feel like I participate in so many complex ways, but just trying to understand those broader phenomena.
I'm so glad you brought that up, so I don't have to, because I was going to, because your first paper, which I've read so many times, is this great investigation into the nature of the aesthetic and into the idea of somatic experience. And then you told me you wanted to write about itches, and again, I thought that's perfect, that's great. And then you sent me your case study, and about 2/3 of the way through it, it takes a sharp left turn into talking about justice, and this is not something I saw coming. And this is another thing that connects your paper with Alex, is you both start off with these discussions about the nature of taste and the nature of the aesthetic and what it means, and you both end up in the land of justice. Is this just the way that aesthetics goes? Is it something peculiar about the aesthetic? or your own personal interest? I mean, most philosophers work in a bunch of different areas. So is this just a weird coincidence? Or is there something more beneath this? Why are we talking about justice?
I think aesthetics is moving in this direction. I think there's something going on where a lot of aestheticians now are starting to recognize, oh, wow, the aesthetic, it's not, once you move from, oh, aesthetics is about appreciating art to aesthetics plays a role in everyday life in so many different ways. I think it's not a big leap then to think about, oh, wait a second, what role does the aesthetic play in our everyday interactions and in the power dynamics that are operative there? So I think it's a broader movement that we're participating in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think even if you look at other areas of philosophy, I think you can see this shift sort of all over the place, right? It's like if you think of philosophy of language, for example, it's like rewind 100 years. It's a lot of like, okay, semantics, propositions, like blah, blah, blah. And then like rewind only 50 years. And suddenly we're talking about like speech acts and like communication with other people. And look at now, and we're talking about like, what is it that we're doing with language, and with whom are we trying to communicate explicitly or implicitly? And, you know, like how do dog whistles work and stuff like that. So I think that this shift is happening all over philosophy. And it's unsurprising that it's like percolating up in aesthetics too.
Now, Alex, you in particular, in your case, you are talking about Taco Bell. I really wish I had more time to eat that taco right now because it's delicious.
I see that you also used fire sauce.
Yes, and that's because fire sauce has the heat, but unlike Diablo, has flavor too, and I appreciate that. Sorry. We were talking about, you were talking about highbrow and lowbrow art and the connection, just, I mean, with the very terms to racism and ideas of sort of gatekeeping of appreciation. Do you think there's such a thing as high and low aesthetics? I mean, putting aside the art question, is there high and low appreciation? Is this an artificial or a real distinction? I'm not going to lead you anymore.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about artificial or real distinction. That's, but I think there definitely aren't. There are at least maybe two ways to think about a distinction between like high and low aesthetics as opposed to high and low art. One of them is like the sort of stuff that Sherry's talking about, right? There are like sense modalities that we think of as being like better than others, or like have historically more cachet than others. So like sight traditionally has like higher cachet as a sense modality than like touch or proprioception or something like that. So like when Sherry's talking about itches, in like one of the things she talks about in the case study is like, look, there's this kind of hierarchy of sense modalities, and some of them are kind of like lower or like low brow, you might say, in that kind of terminology. And another way that I've talked about, I think not here but elsewhere, is like we often think of being able to like aesthetic appreciation and aesthetic experience. When we're able to really articulate what's going on, there's something better about the way that we're experiencing, versus if we're kind of like inarticulately appreciating the feel of something or our experience of something. If we aren't able to like fully articulate or fully conceptualize in this kind of theoretical way what's going on, there seems to be something more like we don't respect it enough, or we don't respect it as much as if someone were able to say like, give a discourse like an art critic would. So I think there are a lot of different dimensions of like high and low aesthetic appreciation for sure. Those are at least two.
Yeah, I have a recent doctoral student who finished last year named Cheryl Fraser, and she's been working a lot on fatness and the way that it's represented in media. And she relies a lot on things like blogs, because there's a whole fat fashion community, and there's a whole, you know, sort of aesthetic discourse surrounding fat embodiment and what it is to occupy spaces as a fat person, and how to, you know, resisting these demands that you like make yourself as small as possible. And there's just so much more of that discourse out in the world than there is within the academy, partly because of discrimination against fat scholars. and fat people in all professional domains. So I think there's there are these discourses that happen outside the academy that don't use the structures and the language of the academy, but that are extremely important. And I think we're starting to see more scholars who are in recognized positions kind of bringing those discourses into our academic work.
So how much, when the two of you are teaching philosophy of art, when you're teaching aesthetics, how much is it grounded at this point in art, and how much is it grounded in the ordinary?
Well, when I teach, I guess when I teach different kinds of philosophy of art and aesthetics courses. And when I teach the kind of basic survey overview of philosophy of art and aesthetics, the thing I say on day one is the reason the title of this course is Aesthetics and Philosophy of Art is because we're going to talk about both of those things. And even when I just taught a course called Ethical Issues in Art, and the first day I was like, I would have titled this course Ethical Issues in Art and Aesthetics, but the character limit was too short. So, I mean, I really try to grab from both bags, so to speak.
Yeah, I would say I do the same, and it's similar. If I'm teaching, there's a kind of undergraduate course that I teach, and that's more of a mix. If I'm teaching, a graduate seminar, it's more likely these days to relate, to kind of bring in a lot of the ways that the aesthetic operates socially and politically, and not to focus principally on art.
So, I mean, the way that my school organizes philosophy courses into sort of topical buckets, and it lumps aesthetics into the value theory category, which as an ontologist of art has always bothered me, because that's just not sort of what I focus on. But it sounds like more and more the any line between really aesthetics and ethics is breaking down. Not simply a matter of asking ethical questions about art. It's a question of whether there really is a fundamental category distinction between these things.
Yeah, I mean, so for what it's worth, I do think that there is a distinction between them. But I think that, there's so many different things happening, right? Like, one of them is I'm trying to make these issues live to my students. And part of doing that is thinking through, how does art and aesthetics come up in your life? And I think so much of how it comes up in their life is social signaling. And social signaling is so inextricably intertwined with moral and social and political stuff that it's really questions that really want to be discussed and asked. And if you kind of encourage that impulse in the students, the classes just go really much better. And they're way more engaged, and they have really cool things to say, versus if you're kind of oh, we're not talking about that right now. Oh, that's not, we're just interested in the kind of pure, is it beautiful or not? And I do teach that stuff also, it's got to teach Kant in an overview aesthetics course or whatever. But bringing it sort of back around to this stuff that's more important to their lives, I think is part of, for me at least, how it gets really closely interconnected.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I'm being given warnings that we are now out of time for our discussion, as much as I just want to keep going and I want to keep eating my Taco Bell. But the schedule says I'm now to switch over to talk to Brandon and James. So Alex and Sherry, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you'll hang around for some questions afterwards, which I'm sure are building up. And now I get to introduce James and Brandon. So James has written about a fan edit of Star Wars Episode 1, and Brandon has written about and is writing about Taylor Swift re-recording her back catalog. I'm going to start with this, similar to the discussion I was having with Alex and Sherry. What makes these things worthy of philosophical discussion? What is there to that? And while you're answering that, I'm going to move on to a beverage more appropriate to discussing fine art.
James, you want to kick off?
Go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, to go back a bit to your conversation and thinking about philosophy of music and the history of it, right? It's not until the 1990s, basically, that you get philosophers talking about anything other than Western classical music. With Ted Gracek writing about rock music. And then, now, with my case study, I'm writing about popular music. I'm writing about Taylor Swift, which is something that, 40 years ago, no one would have been thinking about. Obviously, she hadn't been born 40 years ago, but the general topic of popular music and pop artists. But yeah, I think it's really, Taylor Swift's re-recording project is deeply philosophically interesting, with respect to questions of copyright, questions of appropriation art, which, Sherry's an expert on, as, Darren, you've written about both copyright and appropriation art, with respect to, our experience of these things, right? They sound just like the originals. And so, more or less. And so there's this question of, well, how do we appreciate these things, these new recordings in relation to the originals? And so I think there's a lot of deep philosophical questions here.
I thought you were going to ask a slightly different question, Darren. I thought you were going to ask, how we got interested in these cases.
Well, you could tell me that too.
But you asked how is it philosophical? And I guess I'm not sure I did think it was very philosophical for a long time, right? I'm a Gen Xer, so for decades I never would have thought of writing about Star Wars, which was the thing that I grew up with and loved when I was a kid, and then hated when I was a young adult, and then went through a bunch of other emotions. It didn't seem serious enough, but for reasons that Alex discussed earlier, that Brandon I think already mentioned. I think the field has changed a little bit, and I think it's opened up to where there is now permission to talk more openly about what would be considered low art. And also, and maybe this is something that really grabs me about the Phantom Edit case, democratizing popular art. So not the actions and activities of the professional artists or entertainers, or in some cases, corporations that own these pieces of art and entertainment, but rather fans and audiences and fandoms. And I found myself getting interested in the rights, responsibilities, and aesthetic and moral activities of audience members, which I think, at least in philosophy, has really been under-theorized and just under-discussed.
I mean, so we're sort of back to what Alex was talking about, the idea of there's this other discussion that's very rich, aesthetic and ethical discussion that goes on the internet, that philosophers, as Brandon pointed out, until very recently ignored, or I mean, maybe less aggressively were ignorant of, were just sort of aware was there, or had partitioned, had separated themselves out from and said, here's my professional area and I have to talk about Mozart and Bach, and here's the area over here. When I'm not working, then I get to listen to Taylor Swift. Do you think this represents a new movement in aesthetics? In general, you talked about, James, about getting permission to do this. Do you feel like it's a permission thing?
I honestly felt like when you sent me the invitation to do this, that I had to sort of give myself permission to say, I'm going to write about the kind of thing I wouldn't normally. When you said write about anything you want, I thought, well, then I'm going to write about the kind of thing I haven't written about before, and the kind of thing that I find, except, occasionally for blogs and other kind of unofficial things. And so I do think it is something that I was trained not to do. And it is kind of fun to do it and to bring two different kinds of ways of thinking about art in my personal life together. Thinking, again, getting back to something Alex said earlier about those two modes of thought that are sometimes at war with one another, right? Being able to say, no, here's an argument that I would just have with my friends about the most recent Star Wars movie, and then here's a philosophical question about the extent of an artist's right to control how their work is understood and processed by the public.
Okay, so let's talk about these two cases a little bit, because I picked the four of you to talk here because, much like my editing style, I wanted as little work to do as possible, and I figured the four of you could just carry on conversations. I didn't really have to do anything, and it's working well. But weird coincidences, right? Both Sherry and Alex end up talking about justice, although they're talking about these sort of fundamental aesthetic issues. And both of you have ended up talking about, there's a bunch of different ways I could describe how these overlap. So tell me about the Phantom Edit. I didn't know about the Phantom Edit before you wrote about it. So can you give like a brief overview of what this thing is?
Sure. I heard about it right away. So I saw the Phantom Menace opening night. I out myself in the piece as a complete Star Wars nerd, and might as well out myself here too. And the first thing we all did afterwards was to say, how could we fix this? He did it wrong. And I wanted a better version of what I saw immediately. And it was, I think I heard about it almost right away, within a few months.
This is the days of VHS tapes.
Yeah. So it was within 2 or 3 months of the VHS tape being released. Rumors started to fly about this Phantom Edit, and it was impossible to get and remains almost impossible to get. So what the Phantom Edit is, and originally circulated on VHS, as you said, but I believe that if you can get a copy these days, it's more likely to be a DVD copy. I don't think you can get it legally, but I think some people have procured one. What he basically did was to take the original, and he was a professional, Mike Nichols, perhaps still is, I'm not sure, but he did it with editing equipment that these days most people have access to. He cut whole scenes, he literally cut things out.
Good. Some of them are terrible.
He put a new crawl at the beginning, the opening crawl text at the beginning. He also, because Star Wars has alien languages subtitled, you can change dialogue without new audio simply by offering different translations, right, in the subtitling. So through these devices, he cut about 20 minutes from the original, but he was able to change the tone, a lot less childish humor, and quite a bit. I still haven't seen it because I don't want to procure it illegally. So anybody out there can get me a copy legally. Let me know.
FYI, it might not be legally possible to have
it might not be legally possible, yeah.
So conversely, Taylor Swift is sort of doing the opposite. Rather than taking something that somebody else made and sort of personalizing that, she's taking something that she made and is doing her darndest to make it again as closely as possible. So, there are so many things floating around between these. Are these both acts of what Jonathan Neufeld calls aesthetic disobedience? Are these like rule breakings for aesthetic's sake?
I think so. I think so in the Taylor Swift case. At least it's something very much like aesthetic disobedience, right? Where, a norm in the art world is originality, right? And Taylor Swift is doing something that very few artists before her have done, which is just recording an album again. And she's going to do it 6 times. She's done it twice. The next one comes out, I think, in July, and then there'll be 3 more after that. And so it's at least violating that particular norm, although she's doing it not so much for artistic reasons, but rather because she does not own the rights to the copyright of her first 6 albums. And so sort of as a practical matter of regaining her artwork, she's just re-recording them.
Well, to introduce something that again came up in the conversation with Sherry and Alex, how does the involvement of corporations change our relationship with art and appreciation? Things like you've both talked about copyright law, which is my baby. How does this change the game? Is there anything like pure art anymore? Was there ever pure art?
I mean, before corporations, art was mediated or transmitted through the church, essentially, right? And so, as the world became more secular and more capitalistic, corporations took over that role. But yeah, most of the art, at least popular art or mass art that we engage with, is mediated through corporations, whether it's music corporations or whether it's Spotify or whatever.
Yeah, I think that the corporations are another way in which this discussion becomes political and involves discussions of justice, just as in the earlier conversation. I didn't, I think, put this detail in the piece because it's not about the Phantom Edit, but George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars and Lucasfilm, have from the very beginning tried to exercise an enormous amount of control. So for example, in 1977, they set up their own official fan club. I was a member, and they would send a fan newsletter, and I could order a special, album of Star Wars songs for the newsletter. And there were other fan clubs too, independent fan clubs that started up. Lucas did everything he could to quash those fan clubs. He couldn't shut them down, but he tried to control what they could do. And he tried to control the fan fiction that was being published and sent threatening letters and so on. So when you've got a corporation, right, controlling a piece of art, there's a literal exercise of economic and political power, right? And then you've got the consumers of the art. Sometimes they're kids, as I was, right? Sometimes they're not, who are trying to appreciate it in their own way. Sometimes they're trying to make something creative of their own, right? And it actually becomes a political struggle for them to share the ideas that they have, the fan fiction they want to make, the fan art they want to produce. So if it was just George Lucas and he didn't have the power of a corporation and its lawyers behind him, I think it would be a different matter.
Can I jump in real quick, Darren?
Do.
Right. I think the Star Wars case is such a rich one. And I mean, I have probably an unlicensed Chewbacca on my t-shirt, which was unintentional, by the way, just a nice coincidence. But James, what do you make of, I'm taking over like YouTube series role, host role. What do you think of the despecialized editions of Star Wars, right? Because it sort of relates to the Taylor Swift case of kind of trying to get back to the original and recreate it as much as possible, right? The despecialized edition is sort of this massive fan effort to go back to the original trilogy as it was released, 70s and 80s, as opposed to the, bastardized versions that George Lucas, edited and changed in the 90s and subsequently.
This is another way in which I think our two cases connect, because there's this idea that Lucas has that only the original artist should have the authority to modify that original creation and also to decide which version is authoritative, right? And that is a thing that Taylor Swift, I take it, is trying to do in her own way. And one of the things I find interesting, and I'd like to hear you talk about more, now I'm playing host, is the decisions that Taylor Swift made sometimes not to reproduce faithfully what she had done in the original albums, but to change it. But to answer your question, I think it's fantastic. I think it's a real task, a sort of labor of love on behalf of fans. And personally, I'm someone who went out and bought the DVDs of the original trilogy before he did the special edition, which were very hard to get, and originally only on Laserdisc, but they were in one edition bonus disc.
Yep, I got them too.
Yeah, so I have that version, but I think the Despecialized is a really great example of fans sort of working together to non-commercially, right? They're not, just to produce something they really care about.
Yeah, and I'll also add that my kids have not seen the special editions. They've only seen the original bonus discs, right, from the special edition releases.
They will never see Star Wars: A New Hope, but only Star Wars.
Exactly.
So, and this makes me think, sorry, Colleen, should the next edition of my textbook have a chapter on art and agency? Is that the way we're going with art stuff? It sounds like in actually all four of these cases, an agency question. Is this the new wave? Is this what's coming?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's very exciting. And the more I think one takes these, what look like frivolous, kind of low art cases and starts looking at them seriously, the more one sees different kinds of philosophical questions. And the question about what is the value of artistic expression where that expression is explicitly derivative, right? And what value does that have in terms of building a community of audience members who value one another and exchange ideas? What value does it have in terms of the person's individual creative agency and developing that? I think it's really, I think it's fertile ground.
What I like about all this, being me, is the problems it brings up for, just classic philosophical questions about authorship, right? Who counts as an author? It's murky at best now. It's difficult, but it's not a thing we want to jettison either. It's not a thing we want to throw out because authorship connects to agency. It's very much at the core of what we're doing here. It's just we're breaking the model. It makes ontology sexy. And in the land of aesthetics, that is always the difficult one, making ontology sexy. Brandon, how does this make ontology sexy?
Oh, how does it not make it sexy is the question, right? No, I think precisely looking at these sorts of cases, it's sort of in popular media, right? Dealing with Star Wars, dealing with Taylor Swift, the authorship question, very much comes into play with, AI generated artworks and just the question of whether they're art, right? And whether there are authors there or who the artist is, right? So there's all this stuff happening now that precisely, so I think you're exactly right, like the authorship agency question and further, to relate it back to what James is talking about, right? Just how much agency should or does an audience have to, in the case of like J.K. Rowling, just, the fandom more or less denied that she has any further control of what's canonically true of the Harry Potter series in virtue
they have shut her out. Yeah.
I used to teach, and probably still will, the Borges short story Pierre Menard in my aesthetics classes as a great way of thinking about ontology and authorship, right? For those who don't know, in the story, Borges imagines this person who tries to rewrite Cervantes' novel word for word and somehow make it their own. But now I would be really interested in teaching that along with your piece, Brandon, because I think there are these very similar questions of sort of what individuates artworks, right? Especially when we imagine them being indistinguishable. Normally I do this following reading some Danto, right? But I think Taylor Swift would fit right in there.
And Brandon, you brought up AI. So Karen Gover is, for the third wave, going to be writing on AI art, which recently the U.S. Copyright Office said that AI produced content is not copyrightable. It cannot be copyrighted, which, oh crap, right? So we've now got layers of authorship and autonomy. We've got ontology. We've got the corporate elements. Is art more complicated than it was 20 years ago?
Yeah, because I mean, in the copyright with respect to Star Wars, Disney owns that now, right? It's not
Yeah.
George Lucas
That's
controlling
right, yeah.
his stuff. It's Disney, and so they get to dictate what's canonical and what's uncanonical, and they can litigate when fans try to make money off of unlicensed Star Wars short films, etc.
Even that stuff's failing because the new trilogy that Disney put out, nobody cares about it.
Yeah,
they all
exactly.
just threw that aside. But what they love is the Mandalorian. Right, this little side project which now anchors canon, and now we have papers like James's recent paper on canon. We're starting to get into these things that for a long time were relegated to just internet discussion boards and blogs and things. Just as we were saying with Sherry and Alex, are now becoming. We're getting permission, as James put it. To talk about these things, and there's a wealth of it out there. It's so exciting that we get to do this.
I think things have changed a lot, but it's also really interesting to connect the issues that we're talking about today with interesting historical precedents. The kind of thing that the Phantom Edit represents wouldn't have been at all remarkable in literature, because in literature, people have been doing that for thousands of years, right?
Well,
yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm just about out of time. I've been given warnings, but forget your warnings. One last little thing. So Alex was talking about I think it was Alex was talking about these issues of justice. And I think what's important about all this and what you're saying, James, is we look back at the things that we were doing before and realized none of them were apolitical, right? There was always political. It's just we didn't talk about it. It's just we assumed that was the status quo. And I think all this new discussion about agency and politics and justice and ethics just makes us realize that there is so much more to be said that we hadn't gotten to. And now we can start digging back through that. And well, I mean, sometimes finding the skeletons in our closets. But so I think this is the time's up for our discussion. That went quickly. And so I want to thank James and Brandon, of course, Alex and Sherry again. And I think that I'm pulling back Christina in to tell us what we're doing next.
Yes, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions. We have one that was submitted in advance. We have someone who wants to ask their question verbally, and then we have another question in the chat. So Bernadette Buckley, you are the first. If you wanted to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks very much for giving me the chance to ask the question directly, because it's so much easier than using the chat. And yeah, thanks for giving me the space. Full disclosure here, I am the convener of the MA in Art and Politics at Goldsmiths. So I have some stuff at stake here, I guess. And it relates to the questions that I'm going to ask. But I do feel as if I'm in a different time warp with some of these questions. I mean, and I wonder why there is this big difference between the discussions that are obviously going on in aesthetics and the ones that are going on in art theory and in political theory, for that matter. But questions like high-low, like originality, like, agency, we've been having these literally for more than 100 years in art theory. So I'm really staggered by the discussion that I have just heard. And maybe you could say something about that. But I have two more specific questions. And the first one probably relates more to the first two speakers and the question about aesthetics in everyday life. I wanted to ask you specifically if you know it of Hito Sterl's essay of about a decade ago, in which he says that on all levels of everyday activity, art doesn't just invade life, but occupies it. And that doesn't, she says, mean that it is omnipresent. It means that there is this complex topology which impacts daily life, and that in everyday life we are now acting aesthetically all the time. That art has possessed us in the guise of endless self-performance, that we are on constant auto-display, for instance. So that's my question for the first two speakers and how they would relate to that argument. My question perhaps for the second two speakers is more to do with the prominence of Rancière in the last 20 years. Who, of course, as you know, appears and makes this argument that aesthetics precedes politics, that the process that separates different domains within the perceptible or within the sensible are in the first instance aesthetic divisions, which are subsequently politicized and which partake in struggles for power. And the question of power was referenced there. So I wonder if you could speak to these questions and help me out a little bit, because I feel as if I'm in a different time zone. Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that we go in order with Sherry and Alex on the first bit, if we can. If anyone wants to weigh in.
I guess I feel like, I mean, so the claim was that art doesn't invade but occupies everyday life, if I remember correctly.
That's
and
exactly
that we're
what I quoted.
That we're constantly performing for each other.
Yeah.
And I think I do think art plays an important role in our understandings of, you know, what are the possible roles that we can occupy in society, like what representations are available to a person like me to enter into. I think art and media representations play an important role in that. I think there's also a lot of non-art activity that plays a role in that as well. I'm really interested in how we engage with each other in sort of disciplinary processes of reinforcing certain kinds of behavior on each other and penalizing certain other kinds of behavior, rewarding certain kinds of occupation of space or self-presentation, penalizing others. So I think art captures some of that and plays a role in some of that, but I also think there are a lot of everyday dynamics that play a role in how we perform for each other aesthetically and how we engage aesthetically.
Yeah, I'll just say something quick about the time warp feeling. And this is also related to actually one of the questions that got asked in writing on the Q&A, which I took a quick look at. Philosophy kind of, I think I'll say, even with other philosophers in the room, seems to like kind of lag behind other humanities and arts disciplines with respect in particular to these kinds of issues. And I think that's in part, if I had to speculate, because philosophers tend to see themselves as like, well, we don't have to think about those like everyday kinds of issues. We're just interested in the like pure facts of, you know, like, what do sentences mean? How do they construct their meanings? Or like, how do we know anything at all about the external world or whatever? And that doesn't have to be like politicized or any of those things. But like in my work for the case study, like my references are, I'm just looking at it here: Bourdieu, Greenberg, Dwight MacDonald, two sociologists, one set of philosophers, someone who works in English. So it's like a lot of pulling from other disciplines because philosophy is kind of lagging behind in this sense. That's all.
Philosophy, I mean, there's a weird history to philosophy, which is like quasi-political, where we have this divide that happens in the 20th century between the continentalists and the analytics, and really sort of building a bridge, not a bridge, pardon me, a wall, a fence between these two conversations that get bifurcated, and you end up with these two camps that are each having their own conversations, but at the same time sort of telling the other side over on the other side of the fence that you're not really doing philosophy. And as a result, they ended up developing different methods, different interests, and just different conversations. And this kept the two apart for decades. It became animosity as much as anything else. And I think what we're seeing now is a nice breakdown in that. It's starting to fall apart. The Continentals, who align largely with the art critical theorists, were interested in how art connects with other things, with how art relates to the rest of our lives. So all these much broader questions. And the analytics traditionally started to ask questions like, what is art? Can we produce necessary and sufficient conditions for these things? And it just became a very microscopic discussion that produced a lot of value. But I think we're starting to see people looking through those holes and having those conversations over the fence. James.
I just, sorry, I wanted to jump in because there's something that Alex said really struck me. A few years ago, I wrote an article about adapting works of literature into film. And I did a pretty thorough search, and I was able to find 3 articles written by philosophers on this topic in English. 3 ever, despite the huge literature in philosophy of film. There's a journal called Adaptation Studies in Film Studies. There's an entire journal. There's like 5 or 6 big anthologies, thousands of articles on this topic, thousands. And you just see this enormous difference in these questions that philosophers have just completely ignored. And right now, I'm working on a book on fandom. And again, I'm reading my way through media studies, psychology, cultural studies, all these other fields that have been so attentive to these questions. And again, what philosophers have had to say, a little, right? Some of them are right here, people who have had things to say about them, but nothing compared to. So I just want to second, we're lagging behind. And I think we're finally starting to make some progress.
I think at the same time, it's like stepping into a candy store and saying, we have all these tools that we developed in this little closet by ourselves in analytic philosophy, and now we get to look at all this other stuff, and it's very exciting, right? It feels like remaking aesthetics. It feels like remaking what we've been doing, and in some ways it's embarrassing, right? What we've missed. It's sad, but at the same time it's so exciting. It's enlivening to take these tools that we've all been trained in and now get to set them loose on, the things that the cultural theorists were talking about, the things that are our lives, and connected to other areas like pop art and justice, and it's great.
So may I just briefly come back on that? Would that be okay? Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I have a similar issue. I mean, that totally makes sense to me, the separation between analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. And it won't come as any surprise to you to hear that I've been trained in the continental philosophical camp, thus, growing up on Deleuze and on Rancière rather than on Quine and Russell. And of course, Deleuze's study on cinema, or Derrida's work on the blind, and going back to what Sherry was saying, I think it was Sherry, about the differentiation between the different senses. Those kind of themes have been dealt with there for a very long time. But also I work in politics, and politics is also a very, I would say, rather conservative tradition, in that it has really only recently opened up to the idea that politics can be done in any way other than rational argument. And that is partly because it has the tradition of political philosophy that it draws on is also steeped, I would say, more in analytic traditions than in continental traditions. But I just wanted to come back on one point, which is to do with the way that we categorize into different fields and into different disciplines. And that question of art and non-art, I think, for us, we in art theory have really thought about this for many decades, and would probably not so much think about art as expression anymore. I mean, I think we stopped using the term expression some decades ago. A lot of the work that is being made now, I would characterize more as processual, as collective. I tend to call it not art, or rather not art. So it's not easy to distinguish between where art stops and ends, as it were. I mean, how do you, as people coming out of the analytic tradition, deal with this kind of complexity?
I mean, I'm just going to start and say it's hard. It's hard because philosophers, analytic philosophers, put things in boxes. It's what we do. It's what we're trained to do. And there is a momentum that we are fighting. I think in terms of dealing with things that don't fit nicely in boxes. And part of that is because maybe some of those boxes were artificial. Like when you're learning language as a child, you learn some sort of artificial structure, and then you move beyond that. But part of it is just because the way that we, as a general public, are dealing with art and dealing with other aspects of our lives is shifting. It's changing. And so I think what we find is we're using those same tools that we've been working on to deconstruct the tools themselves at times. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good to hear. I'd like to see more of that.
But at the same time, it doesn't mean that the tools aren't incredibly valuable. You know, they are ways to understand how these parts of our lives work. On the other hand, you came to a webinar hosted primarily by analytic philosophers of art, and this is exciting. This is the conversation we need to continue having. This is what I like to see breaking down. I've got a new case study for the third edition by Glenn Parsons, who primarily works in issues of environmental aesthetics, and he wrote about a BART piece and connected it to the James Webb Telescope. I mean, it's an exciting time.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, one that was submitted in advance, because I think the questions addressed by Catherine Farriman have largely been answered in the discussion. So the question we had submitted in advance was, I'll just read it out loud. How should we understand the word brackets term aesthetics qualified by contemporary, given the history of ancient, medieval, modern, and postmodern development of theories of aesthetics in the West? In other words, what is the definition of aesthetics based on which the questions are raised in this webinar?
This is where I back away. Okay, but this is where professional obligation makes me come back. I'm gonna point this at Sherry only because her case specifically deals with the nature of the aesthetic, and because, well, I'm going to bring in Alex too, but everyone else can jump in. When Alex was talking about this idea of when she teaches philosophy of art and aesthetics, to make this clean distinction is what is aesthetics now? What does it mean to be contemporary aesthetics? Is this what we've been talking about?
So I guess I would just point back to Alexander Baumgarten's definition of the aesthetic in the 18th century, which really had very much to do with felt experience, with the sensory. I feel like there's a historical legacy for the kinds of things that I talk about, and there's some continuity from the 18th century to today. So I guess I'll throw that out there to start it off.
Yeah, I've never gotten myself super geeked about the what is art, or what is like what are these kind of boundary questions. And sometimes like I had a student ask me once at the beginning of my like aesthetics and philosophy of art course, like, how can we keep going? Like at the very beginning, I do a little bit like, what is art? What is aesthetic experience stuff? And then we just like move on pretty quickly to other questions. And he was like, well, how do we keep going if we haven't settled these questions first? And I was like, you don't go into an ethics class and start the ethics class being like, well, what is ethics? What does it count? Like, what is an ethical question? You know what they are. We're talking about those. It's like, so there's like a kind of, I think, understanding we have that allows us to have these discussions and sort of feel our way through like where the edges might be.
There's a follow-up comment in the chat from the person who asked the question on email. So I'll just read that. In the context of Indian aesthetics, rasa, art, especially drama and poetry, is supposed to constantly remind the art consumers their own lives, their way of living, by way of providing them an aesthetic emotional experience to realize their own self, brackets, where aesthetic is a term primarily identified with the experience provided through art, and it is differentiated from our daily experiences. Just thought I'd add that to the mix.
James.
Yeah, I was thinking about this with respect to the earlier question as well. Not only do I think it's useful, and even though we're late to the party, it's a good thing for analytic philosophers to be paying attention to what's going on in cultural studies and media studies, all these other disciplines. But another thing philosophers have been very late to the party is moving beyond a Western picture, right, of the history of aesthetics and thinking about art. I'm not very familiar with Indian aesthetics. I won't comment there, but I know that when you ask those questions, what is aesthetics in classical Chinese philosophy? Well, first of all, there's no easy way to even translate that because it's just not the kind of questions that gets asked. But when you look at the kinds of questions that they ask about the experience of music, for example, well, sometimes they're very different, and they don't always make the same assumptions about boundaries that have been made, especially since the 18th century in the West. I don't even think before the 18th century in Europe, you see the same kinds of things. So we broaden our, open up to more possibilities again by looking and being more attentive to texts, ideas, and figures that don't just come from North America and Western Europe.
Okay, thanks everyone. I think we've gone substantially over time. Thank you for sticking around, and thanks to all of our participants. It's been a great discussion, and the recording of this will be circulated along with login details next week, so look out for that. And goodbye.